All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we love to dig into all those fascinating topics that make us think, and today is no exception. We're diving headfirst into the sometimes messy, sometimes magical world of relationships.
And who hasn't been there, right?
Uh,
Whether we've experienced it firsthand or watched our friends navigate the ups and downs, relationships are something we can all relate to.
exactly. So for today's deep dive, we're taking inspiration from an article on Very Well Mind called 10 Signs You May Have Marriage Problems.
Now, before anyone panics, let's be clear. This isn't about diagnosing anyone or labeling relationships as doomed.
Right. It's more about understanding some common patterns that experts have identified, those little red flags that might be signaling some deeper issues beneath the surface.
Think of it as a kind of relationship checkup, you know? Just like we go to the doctor for regular checkups to catch potential health issues early on, this is about taking a proactive approach to our relationships and spotting those areas that might need a little extra attention.
So let's start with a sign that we've probably all witnessed firsthand, whether in our own lives or in those oh-so-dramatic reality TV shows.
Yeah.
Constant criticism. Like, seriously, who hasn't encountered that couple who seems to nitpick every little thing the other person does?
It's like they're keeping score, right? Trying to see who can rack up the most complaints about their partner.
Exactly. And while we might laugh it off on TV, the article really hits home when it points out that this constant negativity, even if it's disguised as helpful feedback, can be a major red flag for relationship trouble.
You know what's interesting about criticism? It's not always about the content of what's being said. It's about the way it's being delivered.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Like there's a huge difference between saying, hey, honey, would you mind taking out the trash?
Mm-hmm.
And saying, ugh, you never take out the trash. Why do I always have to do everything around here?
Exactly. And the article does a great job of breaking down the difference between constructive criticism, which is aimed at finding solutions and improving things, and what Dr. John Gottman calls criticism, with a capital C, one of his infamous four horsemen of the apocalypse for relationships.
Okay, 4 horsemen. That sounds intense, like end of the world kind of stuff.
Well, Gottman, who spent decades studying couples and what makes relationships work, identified these 4 communication patterns that can really erode a relationship over time.
So besides criticism, what are the other 3 horsemen?
They are contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And trust me, you don't want these guys galloping into your relationship.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued, but a little scared too. Can you give us an example of how these horsemen might show up in a real-life argument? Like, paint us a picture.
Okay, imagine a couple arguing about, let's say, who's doing more chores around the house. One partner might say something like, "You're so lazy, you never lift a finger around here." That's criticism morphing into contempt, attacking the other person's character rather than addressing the specific behavior.
Ouch, that stings. I can see how that would escalate things quickly.
Right. And then the other partner, feeling attacked, gets defensive. "Oh, so I'm the bad guy. You're the one who always leaves your clothes all over the floor." And before you know it, one or both partners are shutting down completely, refusing to engage. That stonewalling.
Yikes, those horsemen sound like a recipe for relationship disaster. I think we've all been guilty of at least one of those horsemen at some point, right? But the key takeaway here is that it's not just about expressing our feelings, it's about how we express them.
Absolutely. It's about creating a space where both partners feel safe to be vulnerable, to express their needs and concerns without fear of judgment or attack.
Okay, let's move on to another sign that can be a bit more nuanced.
Yeah.
Lack of intimacy. Now, when I say intimacy, I'm not just talking about the between-the-sheets kind of action.
Right, it's about so much more than that.
Exactly. I'm talking about all those little gestures of affection, those moments of connection that make you feel close to your partner.
It's about feeling seen, heard, and understood on a deeper level. It's about those stolen glances across a crowded room, the way you instinctively reach for each other's hand, or the way you just know what the other person is thinking without even saying a word.
It's like you're tuned in to each other's frequency, right? Like you've got that unspoken language that develops between couples.
Precisely. But what happens when those little sparks start to fade? When those moments of connection become less frequent? The article suggests that could be a sign that something's off.
It's like that feeling when you first start dating someone and you can't keep your hands off each other. But then, as time goes on, maybe those sparks start to fizzle a bit. It doesn't necessarily mean the love is gone, but it could be a sign that you need to put some effort into rekindling that flame.
What's fascinating about intimacy is that it can look different for different couples. And what's important for one person might not be as important for another. So it's really about figuring out what makes both of you feel loved and connected.
So true. I mean, some people might crave physical touch, while others might value quality time or words of affirmation.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance and making sure both partners feel fulfilled.
Okay, speaking of feeling disconnected, this next sign is one that I think we can all relate to. Getting stuck in the same argument over and over again. Like a broken record that just keeps skipping on the same scratch.
It's like you're both reading from the same script, and it's a script that's getting pretty stale.
Right. It's like you're trapped in some kind of relationship Groundhog Day, reliving the same fight about who does the dishes or who forgot to pick up the dry cleaning.
But here's the thing. Arguing in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Wait, are you saying that fighting can actually be good for a relationship? Because I think I've heard the opposite my whole life.
It's not about whether you argue, it's about how you argue. Healthy couples argue productively. They listen to each other, they try to understand each other's perspective, and they work towards solutions together.
Okay, that makes sense. But when those same arguments keep popping up over and over again, it's like a sign that something deeper isn't being addressed.
It's like that check engine light on your dashboard that you just keep ignoring, hoping it will magically go away. But eventually, you have to take it to the mechanic and figure out what's really going on under the hood.
I love that analogy. So those recurring arguments are often a symptom of deeper issues.
Okay.
Maybe it's a power struggle, a lack of trust, or unmet needs that aren't being communicated effectively.
Exactly. And it's in those moments that we need to pause, take a step back, and ask ourselves, what's really going on here? What's the root cause of this conflict?
Okay, so we've covered constant criticism, lack of intimacy, and those relationship Groundhog Day arguments. I'm sensing a theme here. Communication, or rather the lack thereof. And speaking of communication breakdowns, the next sign the article highlights is, you guessed it, lack of communication. I mean, let's be real. We've all been there, right? After a long day, sometimes you just want to zone out, scroll through social media, and avoid any kind of meaningful conversation.
We've all been there, for sure. But the article suggests that consistently brushing aside your partner's attempts to connect can lead to some serious trouble down the road.
It's like you're slowly building a wall between yourself and your partner, brick by brick, with every unanswered text, every missed opportunity for connection. And before you know it, you're living in separate emotional fortresses.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? And it highlights how important it is to be intentional about creating those moments of connection, even when we're tired, stressed, or just not feeling super chatty.
So how do we prevent ourselves from building those walls? What does healthy communication look like in a relationship?
It's not just about talking, it's about actively listening. It's about putting down your phone, making eye contact, and really trying to understand what your partner is saying, both verbally and non-verbally.
It's like that saying, seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to have those tough conversations, even when they feel uncomfortable.
Because let's be real, sometimes those conversations can feel more like a battlefield than a safe haven. It's like you're walking on eggshells, worried that anything you say could trigger an explosion.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. But even in those moments of tension, it's about acknowledging those differences, respecting each other's opinions, and finding a way to navigate those conversations with grace and empathy.
All right, so communication is key. Got it. But sometimes, even when we're communicating, our actions might be sending a different message. Like, have you ever noticed that when someone starts avoiding spending time with you, it's usually a sign that something's up?
It's like that slow fade out in a song, where the music gradually decreases in volume until there's just silence. It's a subtle shift, but you can definitely feel it.
Right. And even as someone who enjoys some solo time, I know that consistently making excuses to avoid my partner would be a red flag. I mean, everyone needs some space, but when you're actively avoiding spending time together, it usually means something deeper is going on.
I think what's crucial here is figuring out the why behind that avoidance. Is it fear of conflict, a lack of shared interests, or maybe a growing sense of disconnect or dissatisfaction with the relationship itself?
It's like sweeping those relationship dust bunnies under the rug, thinking they'll magically disappear. But we all know they're just going to accumulate and eventually become a bigger mess to deal with.
Exactly. And sometimes addressing those underlying issues requires a bit of courage and vulnerability. It's about having those tough conversations, even when it feels uncomfortable.
Okay, confession time. I'm a terrible liar. Like, I once tried to convince my friend I'd seen a unicorn in her backyard just to see if I could pull it off.
Oh.
Spoiler alert, I couldn't. But jokes aside, the article makes a serious point about how keeping secrets or lying can erode trust and intimacy in a relationship.
It's like that little crack in a windshield that starts small but can spread and weaken the entire structure over time. While everyone deserves some privacy, keeping secrets that directly affect your partner or the relationship itself can create a breeding ground for suspicion and mistrust.
And of course, there's a difference between harmless white lies, like, honey, that dress doesn't make you look fat at all, and the kind of secrets that can really damage a relationship.
We're talking about hiding important information, being dishonest about your feelings, or engaging in behaviors, would hurt your partner.
And I think those lies and secrets often stem from deeper issues: fear, insecurity, or desire to protect oneself at the expense of the relationship. So it's about recognizing that honesty, even when it's difficult, is ultimately the foundation of a strong and healthy partnership.
Absolutely. Honesty and trust go hand in hand, and when that trust is broken, it can be incredibly difficult to repair.
Speaking of foundations, the next sign on our list is all about trust, or rather, the lack thereof. We've all seen those dramatic movie scenes where the betrayed partner finds the lipstick on the collar, right? Trust shattered in an instant. But the article points out that even without a dramatic betrayal, that constant feeling of suspicion or a need to check up on your partner can be a major red flag.
Trust is like the glue that holds a relationship together. When that glue starts to weaken, everything feels shaky and uncertain. While occasional doubts are normal, persistent mistrust can create a toxic environment filled with anxiety and insecurity.
It's like trying to build a house on quicksand. You might start off strong, but eventually that foundation is going to crumble beneath you.
And rebuilding trust takes time, effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable. It's about acknowledging the hurt that's been caused, making amends, and consistently showing up in a way that earns back that trust.
And now, we arrive at a topic that can be tough to talk about, but is crucial to address: having an affair. I think it's safe to say that affairs are pretty much universally considered a deal breaker in most relationships. They're like that earthquake that shakes the very foundation of your partnership.
It's important to understand that affairs can take different forms, and they're not always just about physical intimacy. Emotional affairs, where someone develops a deep emotional connection with someone outside the marriage, can be equally damaging.
Right, it's not always about the physical act. It's about the emotional betrayal. It's about sharing those intimate parts of yourself with someone other than your partner.
And while affairs might provide a temporary sense of escape or fulfillment, they ultimately distract from addressing the core issues within the primary relationship. They're a symptom of underlying problems, not a solution.
It's like putting a bandage on a bullet wound. It might stop the bleeding temporarily, but it's not going to address the real damage that's been done.
And often affairs are a wake-up call, a sign that something is deeply amiss in the relationship. They can be an opportunity to examine those underlying issues, to seek professional help, and to make a conscious decision about whether to rebuild or move on.
Okay, let's take a moment to process that heavy stuff before we dive into the next sign. Emotionally relying on someone else. Now, we all need our support systems, right? Those friends we can call after a bad day, those family members who always have our backs.
Absolutely. Having a strong support network outside of your relationship is essential. But there's a difference between healthy venting and over-relying on someone outside the relationship for emotional support.
It's like you're outsourcing your emotional intimacy to someone outside the partnership. And while confiding in others can be healthy, constantly relying on a third party to process relationship issues can prevent couples from directly confronting their problems and working toward solutions together.
It's like going to a mechanic to fix your car, but refusing to let them look under the hood. They can't really help you if you're not willing to let them see the problem. And that reluctance to open up to your partner often stems from a breakdown in communication and intimacy within the relationship.
It's about recognizing that your partner should be your primary source of emotional support, your safe harbor in the storm. While it's healthy to have other close relationships, your partner should be the one you turn to first and foremost when you're navigating those choppy emotional waters.
And if you find yourself consistently turning to someone else for emotional support, it's worth asking yourself why. What's preventing you from confiding in your partner? Are there unresolved issues, communication breakdowns, or a general sense of disconnect that need to be addressed?
Asking those questions can be the first step towards rebuilding intimacy and strengthening your bond as a couple. And now we come to the final sign on our list, and it's one that required utmost seriousness and sensitivity: abuse. It's crucial to remember that any form of abuse, physical, verbal, emotional, or sexual, is unacceptable and should never be tolerated.
Abuse is never the victim's fault, and it's essential to seek help immediately if you're experiencing any form of abuse within your relationship.
The article briefly mentions the different types of abuse, and I think it's important to reiterate that abuse can manifest in many ways. It's not always about physical violence. Words, manipulation, control, and isolation can be just as damaging.
Absolutely. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You are not alone, and there is support available. Seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
It's about taking back your power and reclaiming your right to a safe and healthy relationship. Okay, so we've spent the last part of our deep dive exploring all those potential relationship red flags, the warning signs that something might need a little attention. But here's the thing.
We don't want to just leave you hanging with a bunch of problems and no solutions, right?
Right, we're all about solutions, about figuring out how to actually make things better.
Exactly. It's like we've done a thorough diagnosis, now it's time to prescribe the remedy, because recognizing those red flags is just the first step. The real magic happens when we take action, when we actually start shifting those patterns and building a stronger foundation for our relationships.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. The Verywell Mind article we're looking at today doesn't just give us a list of potential problems, it also offers some pretty practical advice on how to address those issues and, where to seek help if you need it. And no surprise here, communication is a big one.
Ah, yes, communication, the holy grail of relationships. But it's more than just talking, right? It's about creating a space where both partners actually feel safe to be vulnerable, to express their needs and desires without fear of judgment or attack.
Because sometimes those conversations can feel more like a battlefield than a safe haven.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like you're walking on eggshells, worried that anything you say could trigger an explosion.
Right. And that's where those communication patterns we talked about earlier, those 4 horsemen can really wreak havoc. When we're constantly criticizing, getting defensive, or shutting down completely, it's basically impossible to have a productive conversation.
So how do we break free from those destructive patterns? How do we create a communication style that actually strengthens our connection instead of tearing it down? Any tips?
Well, first things first, timing is everything. Don't try to have a deep conversation when you're both exhausted after a long day or in the middle of a heated argument,
Yeah, that's never a good idea. Like trying to discuss finances when you're hangry, recipe for disaster.
Exactly. So find a time when you can both be fully present, without distractions, turn off the TV, put down the phones, and really focus on each other.
And I think it's important to create a safe space, too. Like a space where you both feel comfortable expressing yourselves without fear of interruption or judgment.
Oh, absolutely.
And speaking of safe spaces, the article also highlights the importance of setting healthy boundaries in a relationship.
Love that. Boundaries are essential for creating a relationship where both partners feel respected, valued, and empowered to be their authentic selves.
But I think figuring out what healthy boundaries actually look like can be kind of tricky, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we end up building walls instead of boundaries, which creates distance instead of connection.
It's about finding that sweet spot between being open and vulnerable while also protecting your own needs and well-being.
Okay, so how do we navigate that balance? Any practical tips on setting those boundaries?
Well, start by knowing yourself. What are your non-negotiables in a relationship? What are your triggers? What are the things that make you feel safe and respected? Once you know what you need, you can start communicating those needs clearly and respectfully to your partner.
So it's not about issuing ultimatums or demands. It's about having an open and honest conversation about what you need to feel good in the relationship.
Exactly. And it's a two-way street, of course. It's about listening to your partner's needs and boundaries as well, and finding ways to compromise and create a relationship that works for both of you.
Okay, so we've got communication and boundaries covered. But what happens when you've tried all that and you're still feeling stuck?
Sometimes we need a little extra help, right?
Right.
And that's where couples therapy can be so valuable.
I think a lot of people still have this stigma around therapy, like it's a sign of weakness or failure. But honestly, I think seeking professional help is a sign of strength and commitment. It shows that you're willing to invest in your relationship and work towards a better future together.
Absolutely. It's like having a personal trainer for your relationship. A therapist can provide a safe and neutral space for couples to explore their challenges, develop healthier communication skills, and learn new ways to navigate conflict and build intimacy.
And therapy isn't just about fixing problems, right? It's also about strengthening your bond and deepening your connection. It's about learning to understand each other on a deeper level and appreciate your differences. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into relationships. We've covered a lot of ground so far, from those red flags to communication breakdowns to boundaries and therapy. But now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something a little more, well, fun.
I was hoping we'd get to this part. Because let's be real, relationships should be about joy and connection and, that spark that keeps things exciting.
Exactly. And that's where intimacy comes in. But as we mentioned earlier, intimacy is about way more than just the physical stuff.
Right. It's about all those moments of deep connection, those shared experiences that really weave together the fabric of your relationship.
It's about feeling seen and heard and understood on a soul level. It's about those stolen glances across a crowded room, the way you instinctively reach for each other's hand, or even just knowing what the other person is thinking without having to say a word.
It's like you've got your own secret language, right?
Yes. But you know what's funny? We often hear about the importance of communication in relationships, but sometimes I think we forget about the importance of just being present with each other, like actually putting down our phones, turning off the TV, and just enjoying each other's company.
I think that's so important. It's about creating those little pockets of connection throughout the day, those moments where you can really focus on each other and just be present. And, it doesn't always have to be some grand gesture or elaborate date night. Sometimes the most intimate moments happen in the everyday, those little seemingly insignificant moments that you share
Oh,
together.
totally. Like, remember that time I accidentally set off the fire alarm trying to make popcorn? And you just laughed and said, well, at least we know it works. It wasn't exactly romantic, but it was a moment,
Yeah,
A little inside joke that only we understood.
exactly. And those little moments, they add up over time. They become part of your shared history, part of that feeling of we're in this together, which can be so powerful, especially when you're going through tough times as a couple.
Which brings us to another point that I think is so important, but often gets overlooked when we talk about relationships.
Yeah.
Self-care. It's so easy to get caught up in the we that we forget about the me. But taking care of ourselves individually is crucial for showing up as our best selves in our relationships.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. When you're neglecting your own needs, your own emotional and mental and physical well-being, it's really hard to be present and supportive for your partner.
So how do we find that balance between taking care of ourselves and taking care of the relationship? Any tips on how to prioritize self-care without neglecting our partner?
Well, communication is key here too. It's about talking to your partner about what you need, about your desires and your boundaries. Make sure you're both getting enough alone time to recharge and pursue your own passions and connect with friends and family. And just as importantly, support each other's self-care journeys. Celebrate each other's wins, offer encouragement when things are tough, and just create that space where you both feel free to prioritize your well-being.
It's like being each other's biggest cheerleader, right?
Yeah.
Encouraging each other to grow and thrive both individually and as a couple.
Exactly. Because a relationship is at its strongest when both partners feel supported and empowered to be their best selves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive today, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. If you could implement just one piece of advice from this episode, what would it be? What would have the biggest positive impact on your relationship? Would it be setting aside that dedicated time for communication, maybe establishing some healthier boundaries, or prioritizing those little moments of connection and intimacy? Or maybe it's about really committing to self-care, both for yourself and for your partner.
Whatever it is for you, just remember that relationships are a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, twists and turns, moments of joy and moments of challenge. But with awareness, intention, and a willingness to grow together, you can navigate those choppy waters and create a partnership that is both fulfilling and enduring.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We hope you learned something new and feel inspired to create even more love and connection in your own life. Until next time.